Hey everybody, this is Matthew Soltesiak and you're listening to Not the Same Old Lions podcast. Using my sportscasting background, I speak with a variety of guests and interview key players to gain more insight on what makes this team go. As the Detroit Lions enter a new gritty era, we'll look beyond just the kneecaps when it comes to the analysis. Welcome to another episode. In this episode, we're going to analyze the Detroit Lions' moves in free agency as a whole and see how this sets them up for the NFL draft. I'm joined today by James Cook, senior sports writer for the Traverse City Record-Eagle. You can also hear him on the Get Around podcast. It drops on Mondays. Good to have you here, James.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, James, we're looking at free agency. We're analyzing what they did. And when you and I spoke on the eve of it, I think you were thinking the Lions might go in a different direction. We were talking about contracts being in line to get some compensatory picks for the draft next year, but it doesn't look like that's going to be the case after the moves they've made. So how surprised are you by some of this?
I am a little bit. I'm a little surprised. I'm surprised that Chark didn't get as much money as, we thought with how the wide receiver market had been set last year. Going out and getting guys like Cam Sutton and Mosley from the 49ers, the icing on the cake in C.J. Gardner-Johnson. I mean, adding 3 starting level cornerbacks in one free agency period is just kind of crazy. I know 2 of them are on 1 year kind of prove it deals that are pretty reasonable. But Sutton got some pretty good money for 3 years. So I was really surprised about that.
Yeah, I was quite surprised myself with the DJ Shark thing, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but I, like you, expected a much higher salary for him. And then the defensive moves that they made in the secondary was big, and I think that was not just big and exciting, it was solidifying, because an area that had been the Lions' weakness now might be one of their strengths. I mean, you mentioned their biggest moves in the secondary was adding Cam Sutton on that 3-year deal. You got Emmanuel Mosley coming back from an injury. And then the C.J. Gardner-Johnson was that icing on the cake you talked about. With those 3 guys coming, Jeff Okudah and Jerry Jacobs were our top 2 defensive backs for most of the season next year. They might find themselves number 3 and 4 on the depth chart.
Yeah, they could. I mean, the Lions could basically just be hoping that either Mosley or Okudah is healthy for next season. And if one of the 2 is, then they're in good shape. With Mosley coming off, I believe it's a torn ACL last season.
Right. So Mosley, there's a chance that he could earn in a starting position. If not, you're looking at Okudah and Jacobs. The C.J. Gardner-Johnson signing gives us a lot of flexibility because Tracy Walker's coming back from an injury. You've got Kirby Joseph still. Gardner-Johnson could end up in the nickel spot. There's a lot of flexibility. Yeah.
He's one of those DBs that they can move around and play in different spots. He's really good covering, playing the slot. I think he was maybe the top rated corner in the NFL last year in covering the slot, and can also play safety. So he's kind of that guy that they can move around in the back, like they wanted Melifonwu to be, and he could still turn out to be something too. But as right now, he's number 6 then in the depth chart at corner or 5 at safety.
Well, yeah, and I was initially, lukewarm, but then quite excited about Cam Sutton because I spoke to some Pittsburgh fans, and you saw the chat boards. Pittsburgh fans were bummed out that he was leaving. That tells you what they think of a player. And so that instantly helped add a starting caliber player to our defensive secondary that needed one the most. But I remember watching multiple Philadelphia Eagles games in the playoffs and just seeing the way C.J. Gardner-Johnson was playing. I was like, wow, that guy would be amazing to add. But I thought with Kirby Joseph and Tracy Walker, that wasn't even something on our radar as a possibility. I, of course, did not quite understand the flexibility and versatility of C.J. Gardner-Johnson. And that just kind of set everybody over the edge for excitement on the secondary improvement.
Yeah, and why he took a 1-year deal in Detroit and didn't get more than that in free agency, I have no idea. I mean, there's no character issues there. The production is there. He's still fairly young. I think he's like 25, 26. So it's not like he's hitting the magic 30 number, for running backs and DBs and receivers and stuff. So I don't see, and there's no red flag. So I'm like, why did he only get a 1-year deal for $8 million in free agency?
Yeah, I think what likely happened is I heard that he had a chance to sign a multi-year deal with the Eagles early on, and then he didn't take it. And I think what happened, and you saw this probably with multiple players throughout the league, is the free agency money started to dry up a little bit. And so there just
Mhm.
wasn't anything else out there to be offered to him. So his best option was, I'm going to take a 1 year deal at a solid price, but it's only 1 year. And then I can re enter the market next year. And if I can show people 2 years in a row on this, he could really set himself up to be the top guy off the free agency board next year.
Yeah, and the good thing about 1 year deals is that they're not really fully guaranteed, but they sort of are. As long as you don't get hurt early in the season or something like that, or the team cuts you for other reasons, it's kind of guaranteed that you're going to get that money.
And so the Lions put a bunch of money into the secondary. They also put some money into the linebacker position, and that was bringing back Alex Anzalone on a 3 year deal at, I believe, $16 million, which I think is a number that was bigger than a lot of people were expecting. And then they also brought Jalen Reeves-Maybin back as well. What are your thoughts on those signings?
It's interesting to see players from the Lions coming back. So you had Marvin Jones come back too, and then Jalen Reeves-Maybin. And Maybin, people are familiar with him in that he's a good cover linebacker. He's not necessarily an every down linebacker, not necessarily going to be a guy who's going to be a run stuffer, but is definitely more of a nickel linebacker and a very good special teams player. So I think he steps right into the role that Chris Board had last year, if they don't end up bringing him back as well. Anzalone it is what they wanted at linebacker. The defense that they're running doesn't appear to be predicated on having a giant run thumping linebacker in the middle, like a lot of teams seem to think you have to have. And, so he fits that, and that he can play sideline to sideline. He can cover tight ends, cover running backs coming out of the backfield. Their defense is a little bit different than I think what people that have watched football for a long time, where you have a traditional Chris Spielman or somebody like that type in the middle who just shuts down the run. And in this defense, I don't think that they're relying on the linebackers necessarily to shut the run down nearly as much. It's more, getting some pressure up front with the linemen and then having the linebackers support rather than just be the run stuffers.
So were you surprised that Anzalone was a guy that they decided to keep and reinvest in that heavily?
I wasn't surprised that he came back. I was surprised that he got that much money. But it seems that these 1 year deals with the Lions, what they're doing with this is bringing in guys on fairly cheap 1 year deals. And then if they work out in that 1 year, then they give them a fairly lucrative extension off of that. So it doesn't divide the locker room as much when you're bringing in big name free agents from other teams and letting your own guys go. You're bringing in these guys, letting them assimilate, and then giving them the bag of money. So I don't know if that's an intentional thing. It just kind of seems that way. With some of the guys we've seen him bring in, like Bugs and Kaminsky, on these 1 year deals and then re-sign them. And even Jamal Williams to an extent. I mean, his was a 2 year deal, but it wasn't for like a lot of money.
Well, I think what surprised me with Anzalone was the numbers, the 3 year, the 16 million. And I thought they would try and go with somebody that had a bigger name out there, or maybe commanded a little bit more attention. But then I kind of looked at some things and thought about a couple different things. One, Alex Anzalone, while he didn't play good at the beginning of last year for the Lions, he improved throughout the year last year, as in like 2 years ago. And then this past year, he seemed to elevate his game even just a little bit more, that he seems to still be growing as a player. So, A, there is a chance we still have not seen the best of him. He could still improve. And two, there's something to be said for knowing the system that the team is running and being good at it. And you brought that up, that the Lions, they don't run that 4-3 that we're used to seeing. They rely a little bit more on pass rush up front, defensive coverage in the back, and a couple of linebackers to fill it in between.
Yeah, and Anzalone's, he's still only 28. So by the time his contract runs up, he'll be 31, which, we haven't seen like a speed drop off from him or anything. And, he diagnoses plays correctly, and he can drop into coverage. Jalen Reeves-Maybin is a lot like Alex Anzalone in a lot of ways. So they kind of built in their backup for him for that same role. Like you said, I was surprised at how much money it was. But I think that they also rewarded him for being a player who is a captain, a leader, somebody who's respected in the locker room, and rewarded that as a way to kind of prod other players into being, hey, be more like this. Be a good teammate. Be a positive influence in the locker room, and you'll get your reward down the road.
Well, there's something to be said for that with such a young team that the Lions have. He's one of those few veterans on defense. So that's nice to have him in there for that role as well.
Yeah, I mean him, and I mean really your other big veteran is Sutton, who's 28. A lot of your other guys are all guys who are in their second, third, fourth year. So not a lot of guys who've been around for like a long, long time. Aside from maybe Romeo Okwara.
Well, if we move all the way up to the front defensive line, the Lions brought back Isaiah Buggs and John Kaminsky. Huge moves to bring them both back. Kaminsky is the one that's gotten more press, but Buggs in many ways equally important because that's at a position where the Lions were even thinner. And then in addition to bringing those guys back, they restructured the contracts of Charles Harris and Romeo Okwara, which is equally big because we have a lot more cap space and we keep those guys on the roster.
Yeah, usually guys you restructure their contracts for are guys that you plan on having on the team in the future. It's cost prohibitive and hurts the salary cap if you restructure a guy just to save money this year and then cut him next year. So usually those guys that you restructure their contracts to create more cap space are those guys that you plan on having around for a few more years. That's why you see it usually be the veteran players.
Yeah, so I like where the defensive line is going with this. Having Buggs and Kaminsky there helps solidify those spots. Again, I think one of the big goals we're talking about is not taking a step backwards as a team from where we left off last year, but staying equal or going better. And so far on the defensive side, it looks like they have made moves to actually be better, seeing as the secondary seems to be upgraded. The linebacker and defensive line positions seem to be as status quo as they were in a way.
Yeah, and they also they re-signed Will Harris. They re-signed Benito Jones, who's another good depth rotational piece on the defensive line. He had his moments, especially later in the season last year. So maybe he can take another step forward. He's one of those guys that they kind of was a reclamation project last season. It was a high draft pick that was let go by his team.
Well, and I'm also thinking with Harris and Okwara, we might see more of the form we saw from them 2 years ago come back this next year because they had some downtime this past season. So we don't know what we have there. We could be in for a really loaded defensive end position.
Yeah, and it's a pretty good draft this year for defensive end, for defensive tackle, for linebacker, and for corner. All the positions that the Lions were on the top of their list for addressing in the offseason. They, in large part, addressed those to one extent or another in free agency. I think one thing that Holmes has shown in the last few years is not that he just signs one guy at a position and then is okay with that. He'll go out and get multiple guys at a position and say, okay, who's going to take this job?
Well, if we go from the defensive line, we go right over to the offensive line. There is some position battles that are going to be taking place right there. And Evan Brown, the top fill-in right guard, is gone. He left in free agency. Haloti Vaitai has a new contract restructure as well. He missed all of last season due to injury. And the Lions brought in an old guy. He was with us before in Graham Glasgow at the right guard position. Do you like the move of bringing in Glasgow? What is your feeling on the offensive line right now?
Yeah, I mean, Glasgow, he's an older guy, a veteran. He's 30 years old now, but he's somebody that Lions fans are familiar with. He was very good here, and he went to the Broncos on a huge lucrative deal that the Lions weren't going to match at the time. And then in between has had his injury problems. The last year or two, he hasn't played a lot or played particularly well because of that. But they're hoping that he's past that and now and then he can be good. I mean, he can play both guard spots. He can fill in at center if you need him to. And he's a veteran, knows what he's doing, and he doesn't cost them a whole lot. So, I mean, that's a pretty perfect plug in there for your sixth lineman, essentially, to have him. I kind of expected them to lose Evan Brown in free agency just because I figured somebody was going to offer him more money than the Lions would want to match. And then, restructuring Vaitai, I think you've seen that if he's healthy, I think he's their starting guard. And that side of the line, if he's healthy, and then him and, between Ragnow and Sewell, you can just run behind that and teams are going to be hard pressed to stop it.
Oh, I agree with that. And I would love to see Vaitai return to previous form. Also, as you mentioned, the versatility of Graham Glasgow, there really, I don't think, was a much better replacement you could find for Evan Brown than bringing Glasgow in because of his versatility.
And he's a Michigan guy, so that never hurts as well. But that having that guy who can off the bench can play 2-3 spots, and come in and play them all at a high level is much better than running into what they did last year, where when Evan Brown got hurt or when Vaitai got hurt, how many different guys did they play at guard last season, the last half of the year? Having that proven veteran back there is a really nice insurance policy for them.
Awesome. And the running game is important. I mean, that was something that we actually saw falter during part of the year. As much success as the Lions did have, there was a period of the year where the running game was not fired on all cylinders for a variety of reasons. One of the big guys they were trying to bring back was Jamal Williams. He was the main guy to bring back in the running back room. It didn't happen. Instead, they brought David Montgomery on board. He's got a 3-year, $18 million deal with the Lions. They also have Craig Reynolds back, and we've got DeAndre Swift still under contract. I believe that's all we have right now under contract. Before we go too deep into that, what are your thoughts on David Montgomery signing, and what are your thoughts on losing Jamal Williams?
I was kind of surprised that they let Williams go, but I think that David Montgomery is an upgrade. Jamal Williams had a great season last year, and he led the NFL in touchdowns, but he was also fairly one-dimensional in that he was primarily just a goal line back. It was great that teams knew that when they put him in the backfield at the 1-yard line that he was going to get the ball and that he still scored.
Yes, that's pretty impressive.
But Montgomery is a much more flexible player, a much better receiver out of the backfield. A much more reliable guy at giving the ball on 1st and 10 or 2nd and 6, and him picking up 4 yards and putting you kind of ahead of the chains. And just I think just kind of an all around better back. Is he going to be the locker room guy that Jamal Williams was? I don't know, but I haven't heard any bad things about David Montgomery as far as being a locker room guy either. So, and then you've got Reynolds, you've got Jamar Jefferson, I think still under contract, and DeAndre Swift for one more season. So. And there's a lot of talk about the Lions even maybe still drafting a running back in the draft here. And then maybe Swift is just your third down back for a season. And then they let him walk in free agency or try to bring him back on a really cheap deal or something.
I know a lot of people were surprised, like you and myself even, that Jamal Williams did not come back. My attitude going into free agency was don't take a step backwards. Don't do something that opens us up to a vulnerability. And when I looked at the free agent running backs that were going to be out there after the franchise tags went down, you basically saw Miles Sanders, David Montgomery, and Jamal Williams as like the top 3 guys. You could maybe argue another name or two into that category. And my thought was I would be very happy with Jamal Williams back. And if we can't get Jamal Williams back, David Montgomery is the guy I want, because as a NFC North guy, we've seen David Montgomery play over the years. I've always been impressed with his style of play. Like you noted, and I've noted before, he's a much better receiver out of the backfield as well, which means the defenses don't necessarily know you're definitely going to the run with him versus when you had Swift in there, it was a pass or run. So I love the signing of David Montgomery. Am I going to sit here and tell you he's going to do way better than Jamal Williams did? Not necessarily, but he is younger. He does have some skill sets that Williams didn't have. Either way, I think it was crucial for the Lions to either get Williams or Montgomery under contract. From what I heard, they made an offer to Williams. The offer was being shopped. The Lions didn't want to be left out in the cold, so that's why they went and got Montgomery.
And what the money they gave Montgomery is not incredibly expensive.
No.
They got him for less money than they got Anzalone.
Yeah,
So,
and after 2 years, the Lions can walk away from that deal if they want to.
yeah, and like you said, Montgomery is younger. He's 3 years younger than Jamal Williams. So, and speed was never Jamal Williams' thing anyway. Montgomery is also not a guy who's going to be busting off 40, 50, 60-yard runs probably, but he's a guy that's going to be getting you 3-4 yards every time he touches the ball, pretty much.
And it'll definitely be interesting to see, because Montgomery had to play in a little bit different system the last couple of years where his offensive line was nowhere near our offensive line. And so how will he look with this? And will we see more 8 to 9 yard gains instead of the 3 to 4 yard gains?
Yeah, you hope so. I just remember I usually end up listening to the fantasy football radio station on XM a lot. And they just referred to him over the last 2 years as mandatory Montgomery. So if you had him on your team, you have to play it because he's going to get the ball 20, 25 times a game until I'm only missing a couple of games last season, has been incredibly durable.
Well, and it wasn't like the Bears just wanted him to leave. I mean, they believe in Khalil Herbert quite a bit, but I did read that the Bears were interested in bringing him back, and the Vikings were actually also interested in signing him because there's talk that Delvin Cook might be getting let go at some point by the Vikings because of his contract.
Yeah. The Bears definitely did try to re-sign him. And I think it's just another one of those things like what you mentioned, teams trying to get somebody on board before the cupboard's bare in free agency, and they're kind of left out of the loop.
Well, in our free agency pickup of Marvin Jones, I think we probably both agree that probably could not have been a better signing there. We were hoping DJ Chark would come back, but initially we didn't think there was a chance because we thought his contract was going to be way up there, and it never materialized. I don't know if that's because of information that came out later that he's getting another surgery on his ankle or foot. If that played into it, he got a 1-year deal. I also think maybe part of the reason he went to Carolina versus staying in Detroit is the Lions are going to spread the ball around a bit. I think we've seen that. And I think maybe he wants the shot to be the number one guy because that will get him that big next contract.
Yeah. And Carolina traded their number one guy in that trade to get the number one pick, so they can get a quarterback that hopefully throws the ball to Chark. That makes the Bears a little more dangerous this upcoming year, but we'll see if Justin Fields can take care of having a good complement of receivers, and they can maybe put a line in front of them this year. But I think Marvin Jones is like a perfect backup wide receiver in the NFL. I mean, going into the season, if things go well, you got Jamison Williams as your 1, Amon-Ra St. Brown as your 2, and then you got Reynolds still, you've got Khalif Raymond, and then maybe they draft somebody because it's a fairly deep draft in receivers too. They don't need a whole lot of production out of Marvin Jones, but it's nice to have that guy at the back end of your wide receiver core who can come in and be productive. And again, a good locker room guy, a leader, a guy who's, you don't have to worry about it, character or anything like that. A lot of those things add up. He checks off a lot of things, and they got him pretty affordably too.
Well, and I also think that stability to have a veteran and someone who can play the outside like that is huge. I was looking at some numbers, and St. Brown had over 100 receptions last year. But after him, DeAndre Swift was the second leading receiver for the Lions with 48 catches. After him, I believe it was Khalif Raymond with 47. Chark and Reynolds had 38 and 30 catches each. Obviously, a lot of those guys battled injuries. But if Marvin Jones comes in and he gets 45 to 50 catches on the season, that would be solid production from a guy, like you said. When he came here before, he was like a number 2, maybe 1A, 1B with us. We're looking at him at being like a 3 or a 4.
Yeah, I think probably 4 at best. And I can see him being a goal line guy too, because he's not a small receiver. I mean, he's like 6'3"-ish, and very good at getting the contested balls. So, and that's not necessarily the strength of maybe a Jamison Williams or an Amon-Ra St. Brown is red zone, being the red zone target as nearly as much, going and getting that corner fade kind of pass. So it gives him one more thing on offense to be able to use too.
Yeah, I love it. And it just gives more depth as well. It's not just depth, it's quality depth, because we saw a lot of injuries happen last year. If some happen this year, you feel comfortable knowing you've got one more quality guy in there, because we still don't know what we have in Quentin Cephas. I mean, he might develop into something, he might not, but this just gives one more layer going in.
Yeah. Cephas is an interesting player, and all he has to do is stay healthy. That's the thing that he's never done. It seems like whenever he played, he was a threat. And he could be that same guy, that Marvin Jones, that red zone kind of target for him, because he's a big receiver.
Yeah, I guess coming out of college, Jeff Okudah said Quentin Cephas was the toughest guy for him to cover in college. So it would be nice to see him stay healthy and see if he can realize that potential you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and definitely then knocks off a couple of those other guys that they had that they were playing here or there later in the season that hopefully wouldn't have to play this year.
So if we go from the guys catching the ball to the guys throwing the ball, the backup quarterback, we're not bothering talking about Jared Goff. That's fine. That hasn't changed. But we signed Nate Sudfeld as our backup quarterback. He was the backup for most of last year. And at the end of the season, Brad Holmes talked about the need to have an improvement in that position. Nate Sudfeld's re-signing, I don't think, got anybody excited. You can justify it by saying he knows the system. He's been around the team. He must be a good locker room guy. Maybe he helps Goff prepare for the next teams. But I looked it up, and in his entire career, I think the guy has thrown like 37 passes in his like 6-year career, and he has one touchdown pass. What is your reaction to them signing Nate Sudfeld, and why do you think they did it?
I could see the fact that they signed him just being to have another guy there. That doesn't sound exciting, and it's not. So if they draft somebody, which I halfway expect that they will in the middle or later rounds, and then have Sudfeld around as a guy who helps both Goff and the young player and gives them an arm for practices. I could see them drafting somebody like Hendon Hooker, although it's looking now like you're going to have to take him in about the third round to get him, and maybe even higher than that. The one that I really like is Dorian Thompson-Robinson from UCLA, as far as a later round draft pick, but even he's now kind of creeping up in mocks into, instead of being a 6th or 7th round pick, into being a 4th or 5th.
My thought, and maybe it's my confusion really, is you would want a quality backup. And what I mean by a quality backup is somebody who has actual NFL experience. So if Jared Goff does get hurt, you've got somebody that can come in and make some plays, because you've got a talented roster, a roster you have built up, that your goal is to win the division and host a home playoff game. And so are you comfortable with Jared Goff if he were to be hurt with Nate Sudfeld or a rookie? Because I too believe the Lions are going to draft a quarterback. Don't quite know when anymore, but even if they drafted a rookie quarterback in the first round, are you comfortable with them bringing that rookie in as the backup?
It's hard to gauge how good Sudfeld is because we've never really seen him play. He could be a good quarterback. I don't know that he is. I think he's just a professional clipboard holder at this point in his career. But I would much rather have somebody else with more game experience as your backup quarterback.
I think the only reason I have such a frustration about Nate Sudfeld is I keep going back to that game in Philadelphia. He and Jalen Hurts were on the roster, and they kept Jalen Hurts on the bench in the second half when they were playing Washington, the last game of the season. Nate Sudfeld was accomplishing nothing, and you felt like if they put Jalen Hurts in that game, they might beat Washington, but everybody thought that Philadelphia was trying to lose that game to get a better draft pick. And then the coach was fired in the offseason and all this stuff went down. That's the one real evaluation I had of him. Now, it's not fair to evaluate somebody on just one game of their career. There just hasn't been a whole lot of stuff. So there's part of me that thinks maybe he's in there, like you said, just to be there right now, a guy through training camp. Maybe he won't be on the opening day roster. Maybe we'll still sign a veteran quarterback after the draft, because General Manager Holmes talked about some teams waiting, or some players waiting to sign until the draft is over so they know exactly what the quarterback room looks like.
Yeah, and you could be seeing it as like re-signing Sudfeld could be a complete smokescreen to try to convince other teams that they're not taking a quarterback at any point in the draft. It was just a 1-year deal. I don't think that much of the money is guaranteed. And so they could just easily draft somebody else and let him go. That could be a thing too. I mean, NFL draft smoke screens are more and more elaborate every year. It seems like, as teams try to just completely not let anybody else see their hand.
So how does all of this affect the Lions draft? I think the biggest thing that comes to me is quoting William Wallace and just shouting the word freedom, because the Lions now, I feel like, have the freedom to do almost anything they want to do, where before these free agent signings, we were like pigeonholing, like we really need this position here, that one there. Like they had to go defense with that first pick at number 6. And now I'm not sure. So what are you thinking are the biggest holes for the team right now? And I'm just looking at this year, not 2-3 years down the road, but this year, where do we need to add, or what do we need to do to make our team that much better?
I think the first thing is an elite defensive tackle. I mean, you've got Aleem McNeil, and you've got Isaiah Buggs, and you've got Paschal, who can play there and passing downs kind of. And Benito Jones is a rotational guy. But none of those guys are elite guys who can push the pocket and rush the passer on a consistent basis. I don't know if you've seen, one of the things that I saw a rumor online was that the the Lions were supposedly talking to the Titans about Jeffrey Simmons, and possibly the Titans trading up to the 6th pick if a quarterback is there that they like, and giving the Lions Jeffrey Simmons to do that. I don't know if the Lions would do that, because he's going to be a player who's going to command huge money. He's got 1 year left on his deal, but he's, one of the closer things to Aaron Donald in the NFL at defensive tackle right now. So, I mean, it would be maybe one of those last pieces that they need on this defense. It's a pretty good deep draft for edge rushers, so I wouldn't be surprised to see them take one. Even though they don't have a gigantic need there. If Okwara is healthy this year, and they've got Houston, they've got Hutchinson, obviously, but somebody that they can develop for the future when Okwara is not there. That, I think, the kind of the thing you're going to see is them drafting for needs, but not immediate needs. They're going to be drafting based on other guys' contracts to have replacements in house for players that may not be here in a year or two.
Yeah, I think right now the defensive tackle position's probably the biggest position. I still think we need to see what's also going to happen with Levi Onwuzurike. Like, is he going to come back and be a factor on that defensive line? Is he going to overcome these injuries? Because that defensive line position, while the edge is really strong, that elite position is still a question mark. It's as good as it was last year, but of course, there's always that chance to make it better. I did hear about the thing with the Titans. I didn't know if we were swapping first round picks and getting Simmons, or if it was just for our number 6 pick.
I think it would be them trading up to 6, and we would get 11 in Simmons, and then maybe have to throw in some later pick.
I think you could sign me up for that because of the fact that I like the idea of us trading back from 6 and picking up something extra. I think we can get a really good defensive back just a few spots later.
Yeah, you can still get one of the top corners at 11. Even at 11, maybe you could still even get Jalen Carter, which would be ridiculous if you had Simmons in house to draft Carter too. Because he's one of the people that the Lions are linked to at 6 possibly. But now with some of the red flags around him, he may drop a little bit, and he fits pretty perfectly into what the Lions need.
Yeah, I'm sure they're going to do their homework on that. And honestly, I guess I'm going to not judge. I don't have a strong opinion. I don't know all the information. I have seen enough from Dan Campbell and Brad Holmes that I've got trust in them in a way I probably haven't had trust in a coach and a GM for the Lions for a long time. I think they're going to do their homework. I don't think they're going into something blind. But if they say, hey, that's the person we want and he's there, then they can take him.
And they're bringing him in as one of their 30 draft prospects for an individual one-on-one meeting at your team headquarters type of thing. And a lot of GMs use that for guys that they're on the fence about, and they want to gauge their character, and they want to make sure that they're a person that's going to fit not only the team but the locker room and the team chemistry.
And I think that's a brilliant thing for them to do because, yeah, there's a lot to explore here. It's a big deal taking somebody in the top 10, and especially when you want that person to be an immediate contributor. And whoever they take in the first round, if that player or those players, because we currently have 2 picks, can be immediate impact players, think about what that does to our team.
Yeah, especially how they've kind of built it up in that they don't have a whole lot of glaring weaknesses right now anymore. I mean, when I did mock drafts, I was doing all the mock draft simulators and stuff, and I would go corner with 6 and 18 a lot, or trade back a little bit from 6 and still go corner and try to get Witherspoon and Gonzalez. You don't need to do that anymore.
No. And
but I wouldn't be unhappy with either one of those either.
No, I would not be unhappy either, because I think that even goes to the other area which we talked about, or you mentioned, is the Lions will be drafting for the future, not just for this year. And I think drafting another defensive back in the first 2 rounds is something the Lions are going to do. I think it makes a lot of sense, considering a couple of the guys we just signed are 1-year deals, and Jeff Okudah could be in his last year. So it makes sense to add depth there. And since there aren't any glaring holes right now, it makes me think a little bit more about the tight end position, a position that I initially thought the Lions could just live with what they have because it wasn't great, but it was satisfactory. And now, considering how deep this tight end class is, you could get a quality guy even in the 2nd round. I think the Lions are going to draft a tight end in the first 2 rounds. I don't know when and where, but I think it's going to happen, and I think it makes sense.
Yeah, I think they could. I think if they do, it'll be a little bit later, maybe. Although if they're sitting there in the 2nd round and Washington has fallen to him, I mean, he's the number 1 tight end in the draft. I might be hard for them to say no. Same thing with the tight end out of Notre Dame. They already have two pretty good tight ends in the roster in Mitchell and Wright. And then with Zylstra, they have a fully capable third tight end. Could you improve from Zylstra? Yeah, sure. But I don't know how much they need to invest heavily in that position. I think in Ben Johnson's offense, he's shown that he can scheme the tight ends open regardless of having the highest talent in the world. And I think that Mitchell is going to develop quite a bit this season if he stays healthy. I mean, he was not healthy hardly at all last season. So I think that he can develop into that number one type of tight end, but it never hurts to have depth. It never hurts to have a lot of options. So I would not be surprised to see them take a tight end as well.
Yeah, and I'm going to echo what you kind of said there too, is I would rather have it be a second round pick because there's so much talent in the first round. Not that a tight end's not worth it, and I'm not going to play up the whole history of what we've not quite succeeded on, but I think there's other spots that could be very valuable to grab right there in the first round. If this is that deep and we can get a very quality guy in mid to late second round, I would be super happy about it.
They'll probably draft a backup lineman somewhere, I would imagine, too, just to have another young guy to plug in as backup for, Glasgow's only on a 1-year deal.
Yeah, and Jonah Jackson's in the final year of his contract, so I expect them to take a guard at some point or an offensive lineman, maybe first round, but second or third round for sure. I expect they'll do that. Let's talk about another position, which is running back. It's not a glaring need for this year because we're solid. We're as good of a position as last year. We don't have Justin Jackson under contract. So there is room to add another player, but DeAndre Swift is in the final year. We have Montgomery for 2, maybe 3 years. It seems like this would be a time to add a running back. The question is, how high do we go? Do we do the crazy Bijan Robinson thing? Do we wait and try and get, the Alabama running back or somebody else in the second round? What's kind of your thoughts on that?
I think that if Bijan Robinson is sitting there staring you in the face at 18, that him and David Montgomery with Swift as your receiving back would just be a deadly backfield. It would be, depending on what other talent is there, it would be hard to turn down. Given that, though, I mean, drafting first-round running backs has kind of become a thing of the past for the most part. And there's plenty of other pretty good running backs there that, the TCU guy will be there in the middle rounds. Miller, there's a lot of good running backs. Charbonnet, the UCLA guy, will be there second, third round probably. So there's lots of other options. I think that they will bring in another running back. I don't think they want to go into the season with Craig Reynolds as the number 3 running back.
It would be hard for me to be unhappy with the Lions drafting Bijan Robinson wherever they take him. I don't think he'll last to 18, actually. I think he'll be gone by 15. It is rare to draft a running back in the first round, and for a long time I was very much against it. But if I think about the difference maker you could have in your backfield for the next 5 years, it gets enticing. I do think the Lions will draft somebody, though, and it might be a second or third round pick, and I'm okay with that. I just want them to add somebody that they think adds a lot of potential to that running back room in that position.
Mm-hmm. And I think they totally will. And if they don't, then I would expect them to go out and try to re-sign somebody like a Justin Jackson, who's still out there in free agency.
So, yeah, mock drafts have changed mightily since early March and since free agency went through. And, I think a lot of Lions fans' dream scenario would be somehow we get Will Anderson.
Yeah, I think it's kind of I think it's unrealistic at this point, but you never know. I had mock drafts where it happens. I had a mock draft. I had a mock draft the other day that I did where I traded down to 9 with the Bears and picked up like 3 extra picks or something like that. And then at 9, Stroud was still there.
Well, that's a strange mock draft.
And I'm like, okay, I guess, or was it Young? It was one of the 2 quarterbacks was still there at 9. And I'm like, well, then I guess I have to do this, even though I don't want to.
Yeah, with the Lions, I don't think they're going to trade up. You never know. To me, a dream scenario is we can trade back in the first and pick up an extra second or third round pick, and we don't fall back that far, because I don't see anyone sitting there right at the 6th spot that says this is the guy we want. And maybe another team is quarterback desperate and they want to move up for Will Levis if he's there at 6. You never know.
Or Anthony Richardson or whoever. Yeah. I think that's one of the best case scenarios for the Lions is that one of those quarterbacks is there at 6 still, and a team really thinks that they have to make a move at quarterback, or they really, really like that guy in particular and needs to make a move for him.
And like you, I think the Lions will draft a quarterback. I'm kind of hoping it's in the third or fourth round, or heck, even the second round. I hope it's somebody a little bit later that they think they're going to take as a depth person to develop, because as we've talked about, Brad Kaya from like Miami, like 8 years ago, was the only quarterback the Lions have taken as a backup in the last like 15 years.
Yeah, they haven't invested in that position a whole lot, other than Stafford, and I don't know what before that was when they took Drew Stanton in the second round. That didn't work out very well.
No, but at least they were trying back then. And so you need to draft some guys in later rounds to just to bring some talent in and see if you can develop them. And I think this coaching staff, that is one thing they're going to do, because we didn't do that the last 2 years. We'll see. We have a lot to figure out here in the next few weeks. Teams are going to start narrowing down who they want. And I think we can agree the Lions are in a much better position than they were before free agency started.
Yeah, I think it definitely. And they make the draft really, really interesting. And then I'm looking forward to the draft next year being in Detroit.
That's going to be a game changer as well, having the local draft as well. Well, before we get out of here, James, any last things you want to add? I know we're going to do another one of these before the draft and kind of really get into some of the positions and some of the players, but any last thoughts on the recap for free agency, your expectations, and where you see things going?
I mean, a couple of the guys that they re-signed were, they brought back Michael Badgley, so they're going with their kicker. And then they also added a long snapper, which is odd to do in free agency. Even when you have one under contract on the roster, and they brought in another free agent long snapper at above the league minimum. So that'll be interesting to see if it's Jake McQuaid's job or if the incumbent holds the job there. McQuaid's been around for a long time. He's in his 30s, so he knows what he's doing.
Well, I like them signing Badgley because I still think they're going to bring in a rookie kicker and have the two of them compete. But Badgley gives you a little bit of stability versus going in and not knowing anything. He did actually provide some stability last year after things were pretty ugly for a while. And then the long snapper, you're right, that is a surprise. I did hear that there were more than a handful of snaps that took a little extra handling last year, and so maybe that's why they brought in some extra work.
Yeah, I think that's what I had heard too, is that there was a couple of snaps that maybe weren't quite perfect, and that's maybe why a couple of those misses from Badgley came about. So maybe Badgley is even way better than we saw last season, and having a little better long snapper in there will bring that out too.
Well, James, thanks again for joining us on the podcast today.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
And folks, thank you so much for tuning in. Please subscribe to Not the Same Old Lions podcast to get alerts about new episodes. Also, follow the show on Twitter @Matt Soltesiak. And until next time, stay gritty, my friends.